In this discussion update video, I talk about the snarky commentary on both sides over the climate science slides that were shown to Boris Johnson to persuade him that climate change is a thing. And we also look at the slides themselves. We look at the outrage from some at the emergence of the net zero sceptical group amongst the Conservative Party. But first, the inevitable denouement of the Peng Shuai saga as it plays to its conclusion. A couple of months ago, we were talking about the tennis player Peng Shuai, and I made this prediction. After a period out of the spotlight, she would re-emerge in China. She would deny that anything particular had happened, and she would announce her retirement from the international tennis circuit. Well, the Winter Olympics in China gave the perfect opportunity for this to start to roll out. She appeared, sort of, had a couple of carefully controlled and curated meetings and interviews. She carried out an interview with the French journal L'Equipe. Why that journal? Because I'm assuming they were prepared to do it on the terms that were demanded of them, which were fairly extraordinary. Those terms were that the only questions to be asked were all pre-submitted. The magazine was not allowed to add any of its own editorial to the piece or to discuss her answers, just to carry her words without comment. Because obviously that's the sort of thing you do on a perfectly normal day with absolutely nothing untoward going on whatsoever. Why such concern, she asked. Nothing strange happened. Okay, she posted a critical post about a high-up figure in the Communist Party, but that was deleted within 30 minutes. Nothing to see here. And sure, none of her friends in the tennis world have heard from her, been able to reach her, but, you know, she's just around, chilling, in the company of some establishment types, no biggie. Oh, and by the way, I think I'm going to retire from tennis. You know, I'm kind of out of the groove of things with the pandemic and all. Getting on a bit now. Probably time to call it a day. I don't claim too much insight for predicting all that. It simply followed the emerging playbook for when people transgress and get too big for their boots in China. The WTA, which has still had no direct contact with the former Chinese number one doubles player, has said that the interview does not change its position, and good for them. But I'm guessing now this is pretty much it. She will retire. She will live quietly and obediently, low profile in China, probably never leave the country again, certainly not for quite a long time. And at some point, the WTA will have to ask whether it accepts the new reality and seeks a new relationship with one of the biggest sporting marketplaces in the world, or if it sticks doggedly to its position forever after. What is not going to happen is what they're demanding. That an investigation be launched into the conduct of the man who allegedly assaulted her. Not when it's a former Communist Party high-up, and to be honest, not at all. Because one thing the Chinese leadership is apparently very clear about, they don't want Western contagions such as the Me Too movement infecting Chinese discourse. As far as they're concerned, the West is busy ripping itself apart, and while they're happy to watch, they don't see it as a participation sport for their own. One of the things that has been doing the rounds over the last couple of weeks, a presentation that was given to Boris Johnson about climate change by the Met Office, which was reportedly part of a process whereby he became more committed to the issue and to taking action on it. On the one hand, I had this request. Hi Mallen, a Freedom of Information request to get the presentation that convinced Boris Johnson to adopt climate change as the biggest threat. Can you go through it and comment on whether you think it is accurate? The parts about tipping points and predicted CO2 emissions look a bit scary. Then on the other hand, you had pieces like this on Toby Young's Daily Skeptic website. How the green blob duped Boris over climate change. Which doesn't read like any kind of serious response, but we'll see. We'll go back to that. First of all, let's look at what Boris saw. We don't have time to talk in detail slide by slide, but what is the nature of the beast? So the first slide demonstrates current changes, the growth in atmospheric CO2, observed warming, observed sea level rise. The second slide shows the role played by greenhouse gases, similar to what I covered on this channel, with the model showing the difference between the current warming and what would have been expected in the absence of the growth in greenhouse gases. These are from the 2013 IPCC report. Then a slide discussing Arctic sea ice loss. Again, this is data I've covered on this channel. Slide 4, more extremes in a warming world, showing that numbers of days with high temperatures has been increasing, but that so far trends on wettest days is less clear. So it's relatively balanced and all relevant data. Slide 5, impacts of a warming world. Now this isn't a data slide. This is a sort of slide where the person giving the presentation uses it to provide the headlines, the bullet points of what they're talking about, which are flooding and sea levels, wildfires, heat waves and health, biodiversity. We don't know what was verbally said on those topics, but they're all relevant topics. Slide 6, controlling future warming, carbon budgets, talking about the basic point that if you're going to stay within a set temperature increase, then that de facto gives you a carbon budget worldwide. We can calculate how many more emissions it will take to get us to a global average of 1.5 degrees increase on pre-industrial temperatures. And it's fair to say it's a budget that we're burning through pretty quickly. Projections of future climate. This is introducing the IPCC scenarios. What difference it will make based on how many emissions we produce. Not sure I would have done the weird thing with the mirror image between the previous version scenarios and the new version. Personally, I think there would be a strong argument at this point in dropping the RCP 8.5 extreme scenario since it is unrealistic, but in doing so I would then be choosing to mess with the IPCC original, and I can imagine why you wouldn't do that. At least it shows the full range, rather than the sort of pandemic graphs we've seen with just worst case scenarios. Slide 8. Some estimates of how sea level rise scenarios would affect the UK, which seems relevant. Now, I do note here that they have selected maps with just the best case scenario, RCP 2.6, and the unrealistic worst case, RCP 8.5. I get that this shows the physical benefits of taking action. Just don't think I would have used RCP 8.5 in that manner. I'm guessing, having not yet read the critics article, that might be one of the elements that they seize on. It does slightly depend on what they say about it, and the notes suggest that the middle scenario was also provided on a PDF version. But yeah, it's not wrong. I'm not a fan of it, nevertheless. Slide 9, a Met Office prediction of the next 10 years. Which seems in line with the recent trend, so no reason why that would be a surprise to anyone. Seems reasonable. What difference would the different policy choices make to the expected future progress in emissions and warming? Entirely relevant, obviously, if you're talking to the Prime Minister, and it looks broadly as you would expect from the data that we know about. And then the final slide, the ominously titled tipping points. On the left, different things that will happen at some point that may be tipping points. In other words, they create an additional impact that won't get back in its box, at least not quickly, with future reductions. So things like destruction of the Amazon forest, leading to an acceleration of CO2 emissions. If the Greenland ice sheet collapses and goes quicker than projected, leading to locked-in sea level rise. That sort of thing. If the ocean circulation system, the AMOC, should come to a halt or slow down significantly, that would lead to shifts in regional climate. Again, it rather depends on the narrative that accompanied this slide, but mostly the IPCC report suggests imminent problems with these possible tipping points are not expected, not imminently. But the more warming there is, the more likely that they become a real factor going forwards some distance into the future. So they're therefore relevant to mention, things that might mean we get higher impacts than currently expected, so long as you're not playing the Extinction Rebellion game of claiming that they're all happening right now and I mean the end of the world. Nothing on that slide screams that sort of tone of voice. It seems pretty straightforward. So, having gone through these slides, they seem pretty reasonable to me. I'm rather curious to know how the critics are framing their rather absolutist and derisive response. I must have missed something important, or maybe they are. So let's have a look. This article starts with an utterly irrelevant graph of global temperature over the last 500 million years, as far as I can see. This goes back to the days when the world was all one continent, Pangea, and has nothing to do with the presentation that we're discussing or any of the arguments that it implies. It then states that all of those graphs were based on computer models given as evidence, quote, "In fact, they are nothing of the kind, having registered 40 straight years of wrong and usually ludicrously high forecasts." And yet that's simply not true, both because most of the slides were not based on model, some were, and peer-reviewed studies of the performance of those models has shown that they generally have been holding up pretty well. They give no references for their wild claim to the contrary, so it's just climate skeptic mythology which they invite you to take on trust. They suggest that a better graph to show the Prime Minister would be that one they got from the Smithsonian I just referred to show that there is no climate emergency, presumably on the facile argument of, look, the world's been hot before. I dealt with such arguments in my video on the Earth's climate history, but the starting point is just to observe that the Earth saw several mass extinction events prompted by the changes that were shown on that graph. Those extinction events were not associated with any specific temperature, more they were associated with rapid change. If you know that, you'll at least understand why such graphs are no cause for complacency. They then make snide comments about the Prime Minister's wife. They then compare climate models to the rather simple and extreme worst-case scenario pandemic models that were used to justify lockdowns. They reference the comparison. They don't make any kind of substantive point as to why it's a valid comparison, because it isn't really. It's no more valid a comparison than comparing Neil Ferguson's pandemic model with, I don't know, the modelling used to build an airplane or construct a bridge. And that's it. That's the whole of their critique. So, no, not serious. Shame, but there you go. My conclusion is this. I don't see anything in the presentation that we wouldn't expect. Nothing that hypes up the concern, but it does make clear the valid case for taking early action. Really, I don't see why it's even of much interest to the outside world that a presentation took place. One expects these things are happening all the time. But then, these are the times we live in. By the way, one aspect of all this that did attract derisive comment was the revelation in emails associated with the presentation that Number 10 had asked some rather what they considered to be basic questions. For instance, why do climate targets tend to settle on relatively round numbers? 1.5 degrees, 2 degrees, by 2050, that sort of thing. Also, are the IPCC reports written by actual scientists, and can they be trusted? Climate scientists and, of course, activists poured scorn on such questions. Professor Stefan Ramsdorf from the Potsdam Institute, for instance, who tweeted this: "These slides show elementary climate info from warming data via extremes to tipping points, many from IPCC or the Met Office. One would have hoped that this is basic knowledge of every politician on the planet since decades and doesn't have to be shown in 2020. Alas, ... I hate that take. You should never discourage people from asking questions, especially stupid ones. When you take this sort of superior attitude, what you do is you reinforce the highly damaging expectation that politicians are supposed to be experts on all subjects, and it's a huge political gaffe if they get asked a question and they have to admit that they don't know the answer. This is stupid. The more I learn about a subject, the more willing I am to sometimes ask the most basic questions, indeed, the stupid questions. And if the Prime Minister doesn't know who to trust on climate change information, mocking him and ridiculing him, it's unlikely to lead him to the conclusion that the answer is you. I trust the people who actually did the presentation and answered the highly relevant but apparently stupid questions did so with a lot more respect. One of the people who approvingly retweeted the scornful tweet was Roger Hallam. founder of Extinction Rebellion and several offshoots, including the most recently Insulate Britain, the group that blocked motorways and inconvenienced thousands of people going about their daily business. It seems that Insulate Britain, also in the news this week, are throwing in the towel on their particular flavour of activism. They released a statement that included this: "It's with an extremely heavy heart that today we have to announce that as Insulate Britain, we have failed." What they really mean, of course, is that it's your fault for not joining in. And we failed in getting enough of you to join us on the roads to hold this treasonous and corrupt government to account. But just in case you thought that meant that they would be, retiring and maybe keeping chickens or whatever, they added the following: "We will continue our campaign of civil resistance because we only have the next 2 to 3 years to sort it out and prevent us completely failing our children and hitting climate tipping points we cannot control. Now we must accept that we have lost another year. So our next campaign of civil resistance against the betrayal of this country must be even more ambitious. More of us must take a stand. More of you need to join us. We don't get to be bystanders. We either act against evil or we participate in it. We haven't gone away. We're just getting started." This is all compatible with my long-standing prediction since the early days of Extinction Rebellion that it would breed more and more extreme, and I still think potentially violent, offshoots as not very well-rounded people swallow the full implications of their own apocalyptic rhetoric. Next on the agenda, reportedly, is a movement to blockade refineries, fuel trucks and petrol stations. My prediction comes good, I think, the moment that activity tips over into sabotage actions. I would be extremely happy to be wrong about that. Meanwhile, The Guardian leads with a front page story today on "Tories fighting net zero plans are dragging climate into new culture war, experts say." Is there now any headline where you can't tack on the ending "experts say"? Apparently not. Who are these experts? Well, climate scientist and campaigner Michael Mann, in the spirit of his latest book, The New Climate War. He said that the net zero sceptical group in the Conservative Party looked to be trying to drag climate change into a culture war. And he said this was a dangerous new tactic being used by those opposed to addressing the ecological emergency. This is where the front line of the battle is now. And yes, we do have to push back fiercely on this sort of pernicious disinformation. Now look, this is where it gets a bit messy, because on the one hand, the claim about misinformation isn't wholly wrong. For instance, the group's chair, Craig McKinley, did a Times opinion piece on energy that did manage to get just about all of its facts wrong, except for the fact that higher gas prices have been a major part of the current increases. But on the other hand, there is legitimate political debate here, focused on policy choices that do desperately require critical scrutiny, which the opposition parties are currently not providing. Unfortunately, the activists and the activist scientists seem less than well attuned to the political process on this. And The Guardian sort of unwittingly made my point for me. A number of experts dismiss the claims around the cost of net zero, saying the costs are relatively small and diminishing at less than 1% of GDP by 2050. Are they, though? Speaking as a supporter of the overall goal of net zero, as I am I allowed to be sceptical? Government programmes always overrun. Politicians always find ways to understate costs in official figures. And important large changes rarely come cheap. So it's entirely appropriate for such claims to achieve critical scrutiny. And if the opposition parties won't provide it because they're in campaign mode and they're scared to say anything that might undermine the end goal, then someone has to do it. And that will fall to those who don't share the end goal. And yes, if it turns out that those experts are not correct about those minuscule costs, then the truth has to be uncovered from them unwillingly. A popular campaign to turn the masses against the project becomes more likely to be successful. I mean, it shouldn't be this hard. Any cause that is right should be able to be supported by the full, unvarnished truth. Even within the standard calculations and machinations of democratic policies, even accepting governments will campaign for their position and argue their case. The facts are the facts. They should be able to stand up to the scrutiny and the attack of the opposition. That process makes democracy stronger, not weaker. All right, that's all for today. See you for the news roundup on Friday. Thanks for watching this video. If you liked it, please share with anyone else you think would also enjoy it. Word of mouth is really important to us. And if you've not subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? As the saying goes, that subscribe button won't smash it solid.